The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale, silvery glow over the kitchen. I stood by the window, cradling a mug of coffee between my hands, letting its warmth seep into me. It had been nearly 2 decades since Johnson walked out of our lives, leaving me to pick up the pieces. I didn't dwell on it often, not anymore. The years that followed had been a long uphill climb, and I had learned to carry the scars quietly, like a private badge of survival. But some mornings, when the world was quiet and the snow fell in lazy, drifting flakes, I found myself lingering in the memories I tried so hard to bury. Johnson's departure wasn't just the loss of a partner, it was the dismantling of a life I thought we'd built together. Ethan had only been 6 then, his wide, innocent eyes not fully understanding why his father wasn't coming back. I had held him so tightly that night, his little arms wrapped around my neck as if I were the only anchor he had left. And I suppose I was. Over the years, I worked tirelessly to give him a life that felt whole, even when it wasn't. Late nights, early mornings scrimping and saving. I'd done it all with one goal in mind, to make sure Ethan never felt the void that threatened to swallow us both. And now, looking at the man he had become, I knew it had all been worth it. Ethan, now 23, had grown into someone who inspired me in ways I couldn't have imagined. His passion for photography had started when he was just a boy, wandering through the backyard with an old, scratched camera I'd bought at a yard sale. Back then, it was all clumsy angles and blurry shots of trees, but over time, his eye for beauty sharpened. His talent blossomed, just as he had. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, the faint creak of the wooden floor signaling his arrival. He always moved so quietly, a habit he'd picked up as a child when he didn't want to disturb me. As he stepped into the kitchen, the warmth of his presence filled the room, pulling me out of my thoughts. Ethan approached me with that easy, boyish smile that never failed to tug at my heart. Before I could say anything, he leaned in and kissed my cheek, his lips warm against my cold skin. It was such a simple gesture, yet it spoke volumes, of gratitude, of love, of everything we'd built together. He lingered beside me for a moment, his shoulder brushing mine as he set his camera bag on the counter. The soft fabric of his sweater grazed my arm, a fleeting touch that made me acutely aware of how grown he was now. At 23, he was taller than me, his frame broad and strong, but in moments like this, I could still see the little boy who used to cling to my hand, trusting me to guide him through the world. I watched as he adjusted the strap of his camera bag, his fingers brushing against mine when I reached out to help. The contact was brief, but it sent a warmth through me, grounding me in the moment. He was heading out to photograph the snow-covered landscape, a ritual he had developed over the years. The way he saw the world, finding beauty in the smallest details, reminded me that life, even in its quietest moments, was worth celebrating. As he turned to leave, I followed him to the door, brushing a stray snowflake from his coat. My fingertips lingered on the fabric just a second longer than necessary, and he glanced back at me, his expression soft and knowing. Without a word, he leaned down and kissed my cheek again, the gesture slower this time, as if he wanted me to feel it to understand it. For a moment, I stood there, watching him through the frosted window as he disappeared into the snow. The light framed his figure as he walked, his camera slung over one shoulder, ready to capture the world in all its frozen glory. I pressed a hand to my cheek, where the warmth of his kiss still lingered, and allowed myself to savor the moment. These fleeting touches, these quiet gestures, they were reminders of how far we'd come, of the bond we'd forged through every trial and triumph. The snow continued to fall, soft and unyielding, as I turned back to the kitchen, my heart full in a way that only mornings like this could bring. Later that morning, I stood by the door, pulling on my boots and wrapping a scarf snugly around my neck. Ethan had already left to explore the woods with his camera, but something inside me urged me to follow. I wanted to be part of his world, to share in his love for capturing the beauty of the moment. It wasn't something I'd done often, but today felt different, almost like the snow was calling me out into its quiet embrace. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I trudged through the thick blanket of snow. The world seemed impossibly calm, the kind of calm that wrapped itself around you, forcing you to slow down. As I reached the edge of the woods, I spotted Ethan ahead of me, his camera raised as he focused intently on something in the distance. When he turned, his face lit up with a soft smile that made the cold seem less biting. His camera hung loosely around his neck as he waited for me to catch up, and when I finally did, he placed a hand on my arm, a brief touch, but one that was steady and grounding. I fell into step beside him, the two of us walking in comfortable silence. The snow-laden branches above us formed a canopy of glistening white, their fragile beauty contrasting with the solid, reassuring presence of Ethan at my side. Every so often, he'd pause to adjust his camera, his fingers brushing against mine when I handed him a lens or helped steady the strap over his shoulder. The quiet moments between us felt almost sacred, each touch a reminder of the bond we shared. At one point, as we navigated a narrow path, his hand lightly brushed my lower back, guiding me forward. It was such a small gesture, but it carried a warmth that spread through me like the soft glow of a winter fire. When we reached the lake, the sight took my breath away. The water was partially frozen, its surface reflecting the soft blues and silvers of the sky above. Ethan raised his camera, his movements careful and deliberate as he framed the scene. I stood beside him, my hands buried in my pockets, marveling at the way he worked. There was something almost meditative about watching him. He had an artist's eye, finding beauty in angles and details that most people would overlook. I could see his breath misting in the air as he adjusted the focus, his concentration so intense that it made me smile. I wandered closer to the edge of the lake, the icy surface crunching softly under my boots. Ethan followed me after a moment, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. It wasn't intentional, just one of those fleeting moments when two people move in unison without thinking. But it made me pause, glancing down at our hands before looking back up at him. His gaze was soft, filled with a quiet understanding that needed no words. Before I could step away, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to my cheek, his lips cold from the winter air but still impossibly tender. The gesture was quick, but it lingered in the space between us, filling it with a warmth that made the cold seem distant. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the sensation settle into me. When I opened them again, Ethan had turned back to his camera, his focus shifting once more to the world around us. But I couldn't stop myself from reaching out, brushing a snowflake from his shoulder before letting my hand fall back to my side. The walk was slower this time, our steps more deliberate as we soaked in the fading light. Ethan's hand found mine again, this time on purpose, his fingers squeezing gently before letting go. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't alone, that I never really had been. When we finally reached the house, the warmth inside wrapped around me like a blanket. I watched Ethan as he set his camera down on the counter, his movements unhurried, his expression calm. I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin, the faint imprint of his kiss on my cheek. It was a feeling I carried with me for the rest of the day, a quiet reassurance that no matter how much time passed, the bond between us would always remain. The next morning arrived with a gentle glow filtering through the sheer curtains of my bedroom. The air felt crisp, and for a while, I lay still under the heavy quilt, savoring the cocoon of warmth it offered against the chill outside. It was my birthday. I hadn't planned anything special. Birthdays had become quieter over the years, marked by reflection more than celebration. I stretched lazily, the faint aroma of coffee wafting through the house, pulling me from my thoughts. It was subtle at first, but as I fully woke, it became impossible to ignore. The soft clink of dishes reached my ears, followed by the rhythmic scrape of a spatula against a pan. When I rose and stepped into the hallway, I couldn't help but notice the way the house felt alive, filled with the muted hum of activity that wasn't usually there this early. Ethan's voice, low and steady, hummed a tune from the kitchen. I hesitated for a moment, just out of sight, listening and smiling softly to myself. As I rounded the corner, the sight of the kitchen stopped me in my tracks. Ethan stood by the stove, his broad shoulders relaxed as he flipped pancakes with practiced ease. The countertop was a mess of ingredients, flour dusted across the surface, an open carton of eggs, and a few splatters of batter that betrayed his enthusiasm. But the table was a masterpiece. Set with care and intention, it held 2 plates stacked neatly, glasses of freshly squeezed orange juice glistening in the morning light, and a bowl of perfectly arranged fruit. In the center, a small candle flickered, its warm glow casting a soft light across the room. The scene felt like something out of a movie, too perfect to be real. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. Ethan must have felt my presence because he glanced over his shoulder and smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made my heart swell. As we sat to eat, the warmth of the moment seeped into every part of me. The pancakes were light and fluffy, the coffee rich and bold, and the fruit added a burst of sweetness to each bite. The simple pleasure of sharing a meal with Ethan on this quiet morning felt more special than any grand celebration. I felt the occasional brush of his knee against mine under the table as he adjusted his seat, the fleeting contact both grounding and comforting. At one point, as I reached for the fruit bowl, our hands touched briefly, his fingers warm against mine. It was such a small thing, but the familiarity of it filled me with a quiet sense of gratitude. Once we finished eating, Ethan rose and disappeared down the hall. I began to clear the table, but he quickly returned, holding a small, carefully wrapped box in his hands. He placed it in front of me, his expression a mix of excitement and vulnerability. I peeled back the wrapping paper slowly, savoring the anticipation. Inside was a set of lingerie, exquisitely crafted from the kind of delicate fabric I hadn't worn in years. My breath hitched as I held it in my hands, the soft material slipping through my fingers like water. The gesture left me momentarily speechless. It wasn't just the gift itself, it was the thought behind it, the acknowledgement of a part of me I had nearly forgotten, a part that deserved to feel beautiful and desired. As I looked up, Ethan was closer than I realized, standing by my side. His hand brushed my shoulder lightly, the touch lingering as he bent down slightly, pressing a gentle kiss to my lips. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant, as if testing the boundaries of this fragile moment. It wasn't long, just the briefest brush of warmth, but it left me breathless, the intimacy of it reverberating through me long after it ended. I felt my pulse quicken, the room suddenly smaller, quieter. Ethan's gaze lingered on mine for a moment before he stepped back, his hand brushing my arm as he turned to clear the remaining dishes. The contact was brief but electric, the kind of touch that leaves an imprint, no matter how fleeting. The rest of the day unfolded in a haze of reflection and quiet joy. I found myself returning to the gift more than once, running my hands over the fabric as emotions bubbled to the surface. It wasn't just a gift, it was a reminder, a nudge to reconnect with the woman I had once been, the one who felt alive and vibrant and unafraid to embrace her femininity. That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the house in a golden glow, I stood by the window, watching the snow fall in lazy spirals. The house was quiet now, save for the soft creak of floorboards as Ethan moved about. At one point he passed behind me, his hand grazing my lower back in a fleeting gesture that felt both tender and deliberate. I stayed by the window long after he had left, the warmth of his touch still lingering. The snow outside was thick and untouched, its pristine surface glistening in the fading light. It was a moment of stillness, of quiet connection, and as I stood there, I felt a new sense of possibility unfurl within me. Ethan's thoughtful gesture, his careful touches, his quiet presence, they all spoke to a bond that was deeper and more profound than words could capture. It was a reminder that love, in all its forms, had the power to transform even the most ordinary moments into something extraordinary. The days that followed my birthday felt different, as if a shift had occurred beneath the surface of my otherwise quiet routine. It wasn't anything dramatic, but subtle, a renewed energy that crept into my thoughts and lingered there, refusing to be ignored. Ethan seemed to notice it too. He started spending more time at home, his presence filling the house in ways that made it feel warmer, more alive. He'd often bring his camera to the dining table, sorting through his photographs with a quiet focus, the glow of his laptop illuminating his features as I watched from the kitchen. It was during one of those evenings, as I leaned against the counter sipping tea, that an idea took root. My fingers traced the delicate edge of the mug as I glanced at him, lost in his work. The way his passion for photography lit up his face was infectious, and I realized I wanted to feel that spark again, to be a part of something creative, something meaningful. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind buzzed with thoughts of the past, of the days when modeling had been such an integral part of my life. I remembered the thrill of stepping in front of the camera, the rush of creativity that came with bringing a vision to life. It had been years since I'd felt that way, and the realization struck me deeply. The next morning, over breakfast, I mentioned wanting to get back into it. I was hesitant, almost shy about voicing it aloud, but Ethan didn't seem surprised. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. Before I knew it, we were planning a collaboration, his photography and my experience in front of a lens, a blend of our passions that felt natural and exciting. Ethan suggested a nearby photo studio he often rented, a cozy space with soft lighting and a versatile backdrop. The day of the shoot arrived faster than I expected. I spent the morning rummaging through my wardrobe, settling on something simple yet elegant. Among the options was the lingerie Ethan had gifted me, still folded neatly in its box. My fingers brushed over the fabric, its softness reminding me of the thoughtfulness behind the gesture. When we arrived at the studio, the space was bathed in soft, diffused light that made everything feel warm and inviting. Ethan set up his equipment with practiced ease, the quiet hum of his focus grounding me as I took in the room. As we started, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement. It had been so long since I'd done anything like this, and the vulnerability of being in front of the camera again was both thrilling and terrifying. But Ethan had a way of making me feel at ease. His presence was steady, reassuring, and I found myself leaning into the experience with a surprising sense of freedom. At one point, as I adjusted my pose, I felt his hand lightly brush my arm, guiding me into position. The touch was brief, professional, but it lingered in my mind as the shoot continued. There were other moments like that, fleeting instances where our proximity felt charged, the space between us shrinking in subtle but noticeable ways. As the session progressed, something shifted within me. I stopped worrying about how I looked or whether I was doing it right, and instead I focused on the moment, on the way the light played across the room, on the rhythm of Ethan's movements as he captured each shot, on the connection that seemed to flow between us, unspoken but undeniable. At one point, I caught his gaze through the lens, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. It was just a moment, a flicker of something that passed as quickly as it came, but it left me feeling exposed in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. When we finally wrapped up, the studio felt warmer than before, the air charged with the energy of what we created. As Ethan packed up his equipment, I stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street below. The evening light cast a golden glow over everything, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly alive. Ethan joined me by the window, his presence close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. We stood in silence for a while, the weight of the day settling over us like a comforting blanket. Then, without a word, he leaned in and pressed a kiss to my temple, a gesture so soft and fleeting it could have been imagined. But it wasn't. I felt the warmth of it linger long after he pulled away, his hand brushing against mine as he turned to gather the last of his things. As we left the studio, the cold evening air bit at my cheeks, but I didn't mind. There was a fire inside me now, a spark that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't just the shoot or the creative energy it had reignited. It was the bond one felt with Ethan, the way we moved through the world together, connected in ways that words couldn't fully capture. For the first time in years, I felt like I was stepping into a new chapter, one filled with possibility, creativity, and a deeper understanding of the love that bound us. The drive home from the studio was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty or awkward. Instead, it was filled with an unspoken understanding, a shared sense of accomplishment that hung between us like a comforting presence. Ethan carried his equipment upstairs while I lingered in the living room, sinking into the couch and letting the day wash over me. My mind replayed the moments from the shoot, the way the light had danced across the studio walls, the way Ethan's voice had guided me through P***ses with such ease, the way his presence seemed to ground me no matter how nervous I felt. There was something deeply fulfilling about creating together, about weaving our individual talents into something shared. When Ethan returned, he was holding his laptop, the glow of its screen casting soft shadows across his face. He sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. I didn't move away. The warmth of his presence felt grounding, almost necessary after the whirlwind of the day. He opened the laptop and began scrolling through the photos, each one more stunning than the last. The images captured something I hadn't expected, a rawness, a vulnerability that felt both foreign and familiar. It was as if the camera had seen beyond the surface, peeling back layers I hadn't even realized were there. Ethan's arm brushed against mine as he adjusted the screen, his focus unwavering as he studied the photos. The proximity was casual, unassuming, but there was a comfort in it that I couldn't ignore. My gaze shifted from the screen to him, his features softened by the dim light, his expression one of quiet concentration. "Let me show you something," he said, breaking the silence. But instead of words, it was through action. He leaned in slightly, his hand resting briefly on my knee as he adjusted the angle of the laptop toward me. It was a fleeting touch, innocent yet charged with a kind of tenderness that made my heart skip a beat. As I studied the slideshow he'd put together, emotions swelled within me. Each photo told a story of resilience, of rediscovery, of the bond we'd built together over the years. It was more than just a collection of images. It was a reflection of our journey, a testament to the strength that had carried us through life's challenges. At some point, I realized I wasn't just looking at the photos, I was feeling them. The emotions captured in each frame were tangible, almost overwhelming in their intensity. And as the slideshow came to an end, I turned to Ethan, my heart full in a way that words could never adequately express. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at me, a depth of understanding that felt almost too much to bear. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. It wasn't planned or calculated. It was instinctive, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything I couldn't say. And as my lips lingered there for just a moment longer than necessary, I felt him turn slightly, his cheek brushing against mine. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, but its imprint remained, a warmth that spread through me like the glow of a fire on a cold winter night. Ethan didn't say anything, and neither did I. We didn't need to. The rest of the evening unfolded in a haze of quiet contentment. We talked about the next steps for the project, brainstorming ideas for how we could expand on what we'd created. The air between us was lighter now, charged with a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. By the time I went to bed that night, the house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. Instead, it felt alive, humming with the energy of new beginnings. As I slipped under the covers, my thoughts lingered on the day, the creativity, the connection, the fleeting moments that had passed between us, each one leaving an indelible mark. And as sleep finally claimed me, I realized something. This wasn't just about rediscovering my passion for modeling or Ethan's talent for photography. It was about us, about finding new ways to connect, to create, to be there for each other in ways that mattered. It was the start of a new chapter, one I couldn't wait to write together.